close your eyes for a moment. Picture a street, a narrow street in Providence, Rhode Island. It's evening, late autumn, the kind of cold that comes off the ocean and settles into the brick. The kind of cold that makes people walk faster, keep their heads down, say less. On Atwell's Avenue, in the heart of a neighborhood called Federal Hill, the city's Italian quarter, there's a storefront, unremarkable, small, the kind of place you'd walk past 100 times without noticing. The window displays say something about vending machines, coin-operated machines, cigarette dispensers, pinball distributors. Inside there's a desk, a phone, an ashtray, a man. The man sits very still. He is not large. He does not carry himself like someone who needs to make an impression. His suits are clean. His voice when he speaks is quiet. He does not shout. He does not threaten with raised fists or wave guns. He doesn't have to. His name was Raymond Laredo Salvatore Patriarca. And from that little room above a vending machine business on Atwell's Avenue, he ran all of New England. Not part of it, not a piece of it, all of it, every card game, every numbers racket, every loan sharking operation, every book in Boston, every casino connection, every dock in Providence, every envelope that passed between a politician and a criminal, every whispered conversation in every backroom from Portland, Maine to New Haven, Connecticut. He ran it from that desk, from that room, from a building that smelled like cigarette paper and machine oil. While legitimate businessmen were paying taxes and attending church and coaching Little League, Raymond Patriarca was running the most sophisticated criminal enterprise on the East Coast of a room that looked like a broom closet. The FBI knew he was there. They spent 30 years trying to stop him. He built an empire that took 3 decades to crack. And even when it cracked, it didn't fall all at once. It fell slowly, like a building that's been hollowing from the inside, floor by floor, brick by brick, until one day there's almost nothing left, just the memory of what it was, and the name. This is the story of the Patriarca Crime Family. From a 1916 street murder in Boston, to a civil lawsuit over a stolen coin collection in 2025, from rum-running boats on the Providence waterfront, to a seat on the Mafia's National Commission, from Omerta blood oaths to FBI informants and RICO indictments. This is a full story. Take your time with it. Get comfortable. There's no rush tonight. Before we go any further, welcome. If this is your first time here, this is going to be a long one, a full story. The kind of story that's best told slowly in the dark when the rest of the world has gone quiet. And let me know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city in the comments. I read every single one. And if you love stories like this, hit subscribe, because there is always another story, and you won't want to miss what's coming. Now, let's go back. All the way back. The story of New England organized crime doesn't begin with Raymond Patriarca. It begins in Brooklyn, New York, with 5 brothers and their mother packing everything they owned into whatever they could carry and moving the family to Providence, Rhode Island, somewhere around the turn of the 20th century. The brothers were named Morelli: Joseph, Frank, Fred, Patsy, and Ralph. Their oldest brother Joseph, called Joe or sometimes Statsy, had the instinct of a natural criminal from almost before he could walk. The family settled in Providence's Federal Hill neighborhood, the tightly packed Italian immigrant quarter on the city's west side. And within a few years, the Morelli brothers had organized themselves into something that looked very much like a criminal enterprise. They started modestly: burglaries, street crimes, theft from freight cars, railroad cars loaded with goods that could be stolen in the night and resold by morning. They were particularly drawn to the shoes. Massachusetts had a booming shoe manufacturing industry, and the freight cars that ran between those factories and their distributors were tempting targets. The Morelli gang hijacked those shipments repeatedly and with remarkable ease. And here, before we go any further, we need to stop and talk about something that has haunted the story of the Morelli gang for 100 years. In April 1920, in the town of South Braintree, Massachusetts, 2 men were shot and killed during a payroll robbery at the Slater and Morrill Shoe Company. The victims were a paymaster named Frederick Parmenter and his guard, Alessandro Berardelli. They were carrying $15,776 in cash, a week's payroll for the factory's workers. Within 3 weeks, 2 Italian immigrant anarchists named Nicholas Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were arrested for the crime. They were tried in 1921, convicted, and, after years of international protest and failed appeals, executed in the electric chair on August 23, 1927. The Sacco and Vanzetti case became one of the most famous miscarriages of justice in American history. Millions of people around the world believed the 2 men were innocent, that they had been convicted not because of evidence, but because they were foreign-born radicals at a time when America was gripped by anti-immigrant, anti-anarchist hysteria. Within the organized crime world, there was never any doubt about what had actually happened. The Sacco and Vanzetti robbery was the work of the Morelli gang. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Joe Morelli bore a striking physical resemblance to Sacco. Gang members had already been convicted of stealing shoes from the same factory. The getaway car matched descriptions associated with the gang. And years later, when mob informant Vincent Teresa, one of the most reliable witnesses to ever come out of New England organized crime, published his memoirs, he included a conversation he'd had with Frank Butsy Morelli himself, not long before Morelli died. Butsy Morelli looked at Teresa and said, "We whacked them out. We killed those guys in a robbery." These 2 greaseballs took it on the chin. That shows you how much justice there really is. Sacco and Vanzetti died in the electric chair for murders they didn't commit. 2 anarchists with no history of violent crime, executed because the real killers were smart enough to let someone else take the blame, and American law enforcement was either too corrupt or too inept to find out the truth. The Morelli gang, the future seedbed of New England organized crime, began their history by watching 2 innocent men die for their crimes. That is where this story begins. By the time Prohibition arrived on January 17, 1920, the same year as the South Braintree robbery, Frank Butsy Morelli had established himself as the most significant criminal figure in Providence. He was the first true dawn of the Rhode Island Mafia. Prohibition transformed everything. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. It was one of the most well-intentioned and catastrophically counterproductive pieces of legislation in American history. Within months of its enactment, it had turned bootlegging into the most profitable industry in the country and handed organized crime a gift that would sustain it for generations. In Providence, Butsy Morelli was ready. Providence's geography was perfectly suited for rum running. Narragansett Bay opened to the Atlantic. Rhode Island's coastline was dotted with inlets, coves, harbors, natural hiding spots where boats could come and go in the dark, unloading cargo that never appeared on any manifest. The state's culture was notoriously resistant to federal oversight. Rhode Island had always gone its own way. Morelli built a distribution network that stretched from the Providence waterfront north to Boston and south into Connecticut. Canadian whiskey, Caribbean rum, European spirits, all of it moved through his routes. He paid off the right people: harbor masters, customs agents, police captains. He understood from the beginning that the most important thing about running an illegal business wasn't the product or the distribution. It was a protection. Control the officials who could stop you, and no one could stop you. Meanwhile, in Boston, the Mafia had its own separate structure. The Boston underworld in the 1910s was dominated by a man named Gaspar DiCola, who led what was loosely called the Boston Family, one of 2 Italian organized crime organizations operating independently in New England. DiCola was old school, careful, connected to the older Sicilian traditions that the American Mafia was built from. On September 21st, 1916, DiCola was murdered. The details of who ordered the killing and who carried it out are lost to history. What matters is what followed. Into the vacancy left by DiCola's death stepped a man named Gaspar Messina, a Sicilian immigrant who had, according to multiple sources, strong connections to the Bonanno crime family in New York City. Messina was a different kind of leader than DiCola. He understood that New England, with its tight Italian immigrant communities and its natural geography, was an ideal place to build something that could endure. He began to establish the structures of what would become a proper mafia family. The hierarchy, the rules, the code of conduct, the mechanisms for settling disputes and collecting tribute. By 1924, Messina was ready to step back. He moved to a quieter role, more advisory than executive. And the man who took over the day-to-day operations of the Boston organization was a figure named Filippo Bucola. In 1930, the American Mafia tore itself apart. The war between Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, known to historians as the Castellammarese War, was the most violent internal conflict in Mafia history. It killed dozens of men. It consumed 2 years of criminal life in New York. And when it ended with Masuria's murder in April 1931 and Maranzano's killing just months later in September, it produced a new and lasting structure for organized crime in America. The Five Families of New York, the National Commission, a federated system of criminal power that gave each regional organization clear territory, clear rules, and a mechanism for resolving disputes without constant bloodshed. The reverberations reached New England immediately. In December 1931, Filippo Bucola's underboss, a man named Joseph Lombardo, made a decisive move. Frank Wallace was the boss of the Guston Gang, a South Boston Irish criminal organization that had long refused to submit to Italian authority, had long operated in territory that the Italian Mafia considered its own, and had come to a meeting at a North End restaurant under the impression that they were there to negotiate. They were not there to negotiate. Wallace and two of his associates were killed inside that restaurant. The message was unmistakable. The new order that had emerged from the Castellammarese War was now in effect in New England. The Italian Mafia was the dominant power. Anyone who thought otherwise would be corrected. In 1932, Frank Morelli's Providence organization formally merged with Bucola's Boston family. 2 decades of parallel operations, friendly rivalry, and occasional cooperation ended with a single organizational decision. They were now one family, one hierarchy, one boss. Filippo Bucola was that boss. For more than 20 years, Filippo Phil Bucola ran the New England crime family. He was not a colorful figure. He did not make speeches. He was not the kind of boss who needed to dominate every room he entered through sheer personality. He was something more useful than that. He was methodical. He was patient. He understood that the most dangerous thing a criminal organization could do was attract too much attention. Under Bucola, the family expanded into loan sharking and illegal gambling across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. It built relationships with the New York families, particularly the Bonannos, who had long had interests in New England and who recognized that a stable, well-organized regional family was better for everyone than chaos. And Bucola made a discovery that would prove crucially important to the next 30 years of New England organized crime. He discovered Raymond Patriarca. In the 1940s, Patriarca was rising through the ranks with a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and political savvy that Bucola recognized immediately as exceptional. When Bucola looked at Patriarca, he saw not just a capable criminal lieutenant, but a potential boss. The kind of man who could take what Bucola had built and make it into something permanent. In 1950, Bucola's hand was forced. The Kefauver Committee, the Senate Special Committee on Organized Crime, chaired by Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, was traveling the country taking testimony from mob figures and law enforcement officials. The hearings were being televised. The American public was watching mobsters testify for the first time in history, and the political pressure on law enforcement to act was mounting. Bucola could feel what was coming. He was not going to wait for it. He had money. He had property in Sicily. He had, through decades of careful cultivation, the connections needed to disappear cleanly from American jurisdiction. On April 27, 1952, Filippo Bucola threw a party. The party was held at his oceanside estate in Johnston, Rhode Island. It was catered. It was lavish by the standards of men who typically did their celebrating in back rooms. Dozens of associates attended. There were toasts. There was music. There were handshakes and embraces, and the kind of formal acknowledgments that men in that world used to mark transitions of power. They were celebrating Bucola's retirement and the ascension of his hand-picked successor, Raymond Patriarca, to day-to-day command of the New England family. 2 years later, in 1954, Bucola boarded a ship. He sailed to Sicily. He purchased a chicken farm. He lived quietly, comfortably, far from American federal prosecutors, until he died in 1987 at the age of 101. He had built something. He had handed it off to the right man. He spent 33 years watching what that man did with it from the safety of a chicken farm in the country of his birth. He never spent a day in an American prison. Raymond Laredo Salvatore Patriarca was born on March 17, 1908, in Worcester, Massachusetts. St. Patrick's Day. He would spend his life running an organization built entirely by men of Italian descent, on a holiday belonging to the Irish. There was a kind of irony in that. It would not be the last. His father, Eleuterio Patriarca, was an Italian immigrant from the village of Arce in the Lazio region of central Italy. His mother, Vincenza Mary Jane de Nubila, was Italian-American. When Raymond was 3 years old, the family moved to Providence, Rhode Island, and settled in Federal Hill. Federal Hill was the soul of Italian Providence. Narrow streets, brick row houses built so close together that neighbors could almost reach through their windows and touch hands. The smell of garlic and tomatoes and bread from the bakeries that opened before sunrise. The sound of Italian spoken with particular cadences of southern Italy and Sicily, blended over generations into something that was neither entirely Italian nor entirely American. Raymond Patriarca grew up in this place. He absorbed it. He understood it in ways that would later prove essential to his power. The way information traveled in a tight community, the way loyalty worked, the way silence was enforced not by law but by culture. He left school when he was 8 years old. This fact is important, not because it marked him as uneducated in any meaningful sense. Raymond Patriarca would demonstrate throughout his life a kind of intelligence that no school teaches, but because it tells you the circumstances. 8 years old, out of school, shining shoes, working as a bellhop, doing whatever he could to bring money into a house that didn't have much of it. His father ran a bar and liquor store on Federal Hill. The boy grew up watching the men who came through, the conversations they had, the way they carried themselves, the hierarchy that existed between them. He absorbed the dynamics of criminal life before he was old enough to participate in it. In 1925, when Raymond was 17, his father died. The family needed money. Raymond was the oldest son, and the streets of Federal Hill offered opportunities to a young man who was willing to reach for them. He reached. Between the ages of 17 and 30, Raymond Patriarca was arrested or charged with crimes on a list that reads like a tour through every category of street-level criminality available in 1920s and 1930s America. He was convicted of breaking prohibition laws in Connecticut in 1925, barely a teenager. The arrests that followed over the next decade included failing to stop for a policeman, breaking and entering white slavery, and masterminding a jailbreak in which a prison guard and a trustee were killed. He was involved in prostitution in his early 20s. He hijacked trucks. He ran bootlegging operations. In 1938, a robbery conviction landed him a 5-year prison sentence. He served 4 months. What happened next was a scandal that would follow Rhode Island politics for years. A man named Daniel H. Coakley, who served as executive counselor to Governor Charles F. Hurley, arranged Patriarca's parole. He filed a petition on behalf of a Catholic priest, Father Fagan, who had supposedly intervened on Patriarca's behalf and attested to his character. Father Fagan did not exist. Coakley had invented him. When the fabrication was discovered, the political fallout was immediate and devastating. A 3-year investigation followed. In 1941, Coakley was impeached and removed from office, one of the only executive counselors in Massachusetts history to suffer that fate. But here's the thing that mattered for Raymond Patriarca. The scandal didn't damage him. It elevated him in the world of the underworld, where power was measured in the ability to make things happen, to reach into institutions and bend them to your will, to demonstrate that the rules that apply to everyone else did not apply to you. This episode was a masterclass. Patriarca had walked out of a 5-year sentence after 4 months. He had done it through connections so deep that they reached the governor's office. He had been arrested 28 times in his life, convicted 7 times, imprisoned 4 times, and he had survived every single one of them, always found a way out, always landed on his feet. The message to send to every criminal in New England was perfectly clear. This man was untouchable. During the 1930s, the Providence Board of Public Safety formally designated Raymond Patriarca as public enemy number 1 in the city of Rhode Island. They put his name on a list They announced to the newspapers that this man was the most dangerous criminal in their city. If Raymond Patriarca cared, he gave no indication. He continued to build. During the 1940s, with Bucola as nominal boss but increasingly absent from day-to-day operations, Patriarca was effectively running the organization. By the time Bucola held his retirement party in 1952, Patriarca had been in control for years already. In 1939, at the age of 31, Raymond Patriarca married a woman named Helen G. Mandela. A year later, she gave him a son. They named him Raymond, too. When Patriarca formally assumed the bossship in 1954, his first major strategic decision was geographic. He moved the family's headquarters from Boston, where it had been based since the days of Messina and Bucola, to Providence. Providence was home. Federal Hill was home. He knew every face, every street, every angle, and he chose, for his headquarters, a place that was the very definition of unassuming. The National Cigarette Service Company and Coin-O-Matic distributors occupied a 2-story wood-frame building on Atwell's Avenue in Federal Hill. It was a legitimate business, or at least it was set up to look like one. It dealt in tobacco vending machines, pinball machines, coin-operated equipment for bars and restaurants and bowling alleys. All cash business. Always had been. The money that moved through coin-operated machines was essentially untraceable. Family members called it simply the office. And the office was exactly that. Not a clubhouse. Not a social gathering spot. A place of business. Patriarca ran the way a chief executive officer runs a corporation, except that the corporation's products were extortion, gambling, murder, and fear. He was there every day. He lived modestly in the Federal Hill neighborhood. He never moved to the suburbs, never built a mansion in the countryside, never performed the kind of ostentatious wealth that attracted attention. He lived in the neighborhood where he'd grown up. He walked to work during warm weather. He would stand outside the Coin-O-Matic on the Atwell's Avenue sidewalk, puffing a cigar, watching the street, watching who came and went, watching whether any face he didn't recognize lingered too long in front of the building. He kept spotters posted throughout the neighborhood. Vincent Teresa, one of the most prominent informants ever emerged from New England organized crime, described Atwell's Avenue under Patriarca as a noisy open-air market that was also an armed camp. Area residents, street vendors, men on corners, all of them watching for law enforcement, for strangers, for anything that looked out of place. If a cop parked his car on the wrong block, the information traveled to the office within minutes. Inside, Patriarca met with people. This was how business was done. You came to him. You explained your problem. You stated your request. You received his answer. His answer was not always yes. His answer was sometimes no. And his answer was occasionally something that made the person who'd asked wish they'd never come. The bugs the FBI would eventually plant in that office in the early 1960s captured the flavor of those conversations. On one recording, Patriarca was overheard telling an associate, "In this thing of ours, your love for your mother and father is one thing. Your love for the family is a different kind of love." It was not spoken as sentiment. It was spoken as instruction. To understand how Raymond Patriarca ran New England, you need to understand the structure he built and the territory it covered. At the top was Patriarca, the boss, undisputed, whose word was final on every matter of consequence. Below him was a consigliere, an advisor, a man who provided counsel and served as a sounding board and sometimes as a mediator in disputes. Patriarca's consigliere for much of his reign was a man named Henry, the referee, Tamelio, a careful, disciplined figure who was also, according to some sources, a member of the Bonanno family in New York, reflecting the complex overlapping relationships between the national families. Below that was the underboss, the number 2, the operational second-in-command. Eventually, after the Angiulo arrangement was made, Gennaro Angiulo would hold this position for the Boston operations. Below the underboss were the capos, captains, each commanding a crew of soldiers. The soldiers were the made men, the fully initiated members of La Cosa Nostra, who ran the actual street-level operations and supervised the associates, the outer ring of men who worked for the family, without being formally inducted into it. Patriarca's territory covered all of Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Maine. The western boundary ran along the Connecticut River, West of that was Genovese territory, based in New York. East of it was New England, and New England was Patriarca from his vending machine office. Patriarca received tribute from every level of the structure. Every gambling operation paid him. Every loan sharking crew paid him. Every criminal enterprise of any significance in New England paid him. A portion of every dollar that changed hands in the illegal economy of the region found its way, eventually, to the desk on Atwells Avenue. In 1957, the Massachusetts Crime Commission conducted a formal investigation into illegal gambling in the state. Their 600-page report, submitted to state lawmakers, identified the Patriarca organization as a controlling force behind what they described as a $2 billion a year gambling network. $2 billion a year. In 1957 money, Raymond Patriarca was not a minor figure in American organized crime. He was one of the most powerful criminals in the country, and the Mafia's National Commission acknowledged this. He was given a seat, equal footing with the bosses of the New York Five families. When the commission met, Patriarca's voice carried weight. His relationships with the other bosses were genuine, built over decades of shared interests, territorial accommodations, and the kind of mutual respect that only comes when both parties know what the other is capable of. He had a stake in the Dunes Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. Casino skimming, the practice of removing cash from the casino's revenue before it was counted and reported, was one of the most lucrative forms of organized crime income in the post-war period. The money was almost impossible to trace. It traveled from the casino counting room to hidden accounts to envelopes that found their way back to bosses in every major city in America. Patriarca's share flowed back to Providence. He reportedly partnered with Frank Sinatra in a racetrack investment in the Berkshires, a story that Sinatra would furiously deny, and that an overeager informant named Joe Barboza would later exaggerate to the point of congressional testimony, creating a national scandal before admitting the details had been rumors. But the Dune stake was real. The commission seat was real. The $2 billion gambling network was real. Raymond Patriarca was now a local crime boss in a small city by the ocean. He was a national figure. One of the most revealing moments in Patriarca's career came not from a murder or a political corruption scandal, but from a business negotiation. In the late 1950s, a man named Gennaro Jerry Angiulo came to see him. Angiulo was 39 years old. He had been born in 1919, the son of Italian immigrants who ran a small grocery store at 98 Prince Street in Boston's North End. He'd served in the Navy during World War II, achieved the rank of chief bosun's mate, a real accomplishment, and come home to a life that his naval service hadn't prepared him for. He and his brothers, Niccolo, Donato, Francesco, Antonio, Michelle, and James, had built something remarkable. Starting from almost nothing in the early 1950s, they had taken control of the numbers racket, illegal lottery, in Boston. They'd leveraged that into loan sharking. They'd invested their profits in legitimate businesses, nightclubs, real estate, and used those to launder the money. They'd expanded, diversified, and by the late 1950s, they were running what was, by any measure, an extremely successful criminal operation in one of America's major cities. But they had a problem. The Angiulo brothers were not made members of the Mafia. They were not formally part of any family. They had no protection from the national organization, and this made them vulnerable. The mafioso who was exploiting that vulnerability most aggressively was a man named Larry Byron Zunino, one of the most feared enforcers in Boston, a man who would later rise to become the third highest ranking figure in the Boston faction. Zunino was shaking the Angiulos down, regularly, with impunity, because they had no family to back them. Angiulo's solution was elegant in its directness. He went straight to the top. He went to Patriarca. He sat across the desk from a man in the vending machine office and made an offer, $50,000 in cash. Right now, a one-time payment for induction into the family, and then $100,000 a year, every year, ongoing tribute. In exchange, the Angiulos would become made members. They would have the protection of the Patriarca name. Zunino's shakedowns would stop. Their operation in Boston would run under the family's umbrella. Patriarca accepted. He was later honest, almost brutal, about what the arrangement was. He described his relationship with Angulo as strictly financial. Angulo was not popular in Providence. He was not well liked by the traditional old guard figures in the family, who found him too flashy, too arrogant, too unwilling to show the kind of deference that the hierarchy expected. Angulo drove a Jeep with the words Italian Stallion on the license plate. He lived in a waterfront mansion in Nahant, a wealthy suburb north of Boston. He owned a 68-foot yacht called the St. Gennaro that he took out in Boston Harbor on weekends. He was not modest, but he made extraordinary money, and he paid his tribute to Providence with perfect regularity. The relationship held for more than 2 decades. Angulo became the underboss overseeing the Boston faction. He and his brothers ran their operations from the old family grocery store on Prince Street, the Dog House, as it was known, which had long since been converted into something very different from a grocery store. And from Prince Street, Gennaro Angulo built what federal prosecutors would eventually describe as a $250,000 a week criminal empire. Gambling, loan sharking, extortion, numbers. Everything illegal in Boston funneled through the Angulo brothers, and a portion of everything came back to the desk on Atwell's Avenue. One of the most striking things about Raymond Patriarca was something that everyone who described him mentioned and none of them fully explained. He had no bodyguards. He walked the streets of Providence unaccompanied. He drove himself. He went to restaurants alone. He stood outside his building on Atwell's Avenue in the warm months, puffing a cigar, watching the street, completely unprotected by any visible security. This was not naive. It was not reckless. It was a statement. The implication was clear. Raymond Patriarca did not need guards because no rational person would make an attempt on his life. The calculation that any potential enemy would have to make. The certainty of swift and total retaliation. The destruction not just of themselves, but their family, their associates, their entire world, made the idea of attacking him functionally impossible. He was protected by the totality of what he represented, not by men with guns. During his years at the height of his power, Patriarca was arrested or charged 28 times. He was convicted 7 times. He went to prison 4 times. In every instance, his hold on the organization was never seriously threatened. The family continued operating during his imprisonments as smoothly as it had while he was free, which was itself an expression of his power. He had built a structure that didn't require his constant presence to function. One FBI report from 1954 noted, with a kind of bewildered respect, that Patriarca reaps a major cut from robberies and thefts in Rhode Island and other states, and was owner and banker of many gambling establishments in Rhode Island. The same report noted that he operated a shakedown racket in the Federal Hills section of Providence, in which young men went from business to business collecting protection money. Those who refused had their windows smashed. Another informant maintained that Patriarca has control of most of the New England area and receives a cut from all gambling activities. The IRS determined that Patriarca owed more than $86,000 in back taxes from 1945 to 1951. He settled for $19,000. He once pressured business owners across Rhode Island to remove competitors' coin-operated machines from their establishments and replace them with his. A competitor secured a court injunction against him. The injunction was granted, then largely ignored. The world bent to Raymond Patriarca. He did not bend to the world. On November 14, 1957, more than 100 of America's most powerful organized crime figures assembled at the estate of Joseph "Joe the Barber" Barbara, a mob figure and soft drink distributor, at his 53-acre property in Appalachian, New York, a small town on the Susquehanna River about 200 miles northwest of New York City. The meeting had been called by Vito Genovese, who had just completed his takeover of what would become the Genovese crime family, following the murder of Albert Anastasia the previous October. Genovese wanted to consolidate his new position. He wanted the bosses of the national organization to acknowledge his leadership. He wanted a coronation. What he got was chaos. State Trooper Sergeant Edgar Croswell had been keeping occasional tabs on Joseph Barber for years, aware that the man had criminal associates and was not actually in the soft drink business in any meaningful sense. When Croswell noticed an unusual number of expensive automobiles with out-of-state plates arriving at the Barber estate, he called for backup and moved in. The raid scattered more than 50 of America's most powerful gangsters across the fields and forests of upstate New York. Men in $500 suits ran through cornfields. They waded through streams. They hid in the undergrowth. Several were detained at roadblocks. Their names and connections were recorded and reported. The names included Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, Joe Bonanno, Carmine Lombardozzi, Sam Monachino, and, from New England, members and representatives of the Patriarca family, including Frank Cacciara. Raymond Patriarca himself was noted as having attended and then escaped. The national press went wild. For years, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had publicly, repeatedly, and emphatically denied that any national organized crime syndicate existed. The Mafia, as a structured national organization, did not exist. Hoover insisted. Organized crime was a local problem. Individual cities, individual criminal enterprises, with no national coordination. After Appalachian, that position was impossible to maintain. 100 mob bosses had driven from across the country to attend a private meeting at an estate in rural New York. They had been captured on film and in police reports. Their names were on the record. Their connections to one another were documented. Hoover responded by creating the FBI's Top Hoodlum program, a coordinated national effort to investigate and prosecute organized crime bosses. He put Raymond Patriarca's name near the top of the list. For Patriarca, the Appalachian disaster was the moment the comfortable era ended. He had operated for years in a world where the FBI was, at best, a minor inconvenience, where political connections and local corruption provided enough insulation to keep federal investigators at arm's length. That world was gone now. The era of absolute federal pressure on the American Mafia had begun. The transition from the Eisenhower administration to the Kennedy administration in January 1961 changed everything for Raymond Patriarca. John F. Kennedy appointed his brother Robert as Attorney General. Robert Kennedy had been obsessed with organized crime since his days as chief counsel for the Senate's McClellan Committee in the late 1950s. He had sat across committee tables from mob bosses and watched them smirk. He had watched them take the Fifth Amendment on question after question after question. He had watched them lie so brazenly and so smoothly that it seemed almost like performance art. He was done watching. Kennedy directed the FBI to make La Cosa Nostra its absolute top priority. J. Edgar Hoover, who had spent years insisting the organization didn't exist and was now forced to pursue it aggressively, mobilized the full resources of the federal government. The tools available included wiretaps, court-approved electronic surveillance, infiltration, and the cultivation of informants within the mob itself. For Raymond Patriarca, who had operated under the comfortable assumption that political connections could always be leveraged to limit his exposure to federal heat, this was a genuine threat. And then Patriarca made it dramatically worse. During congressional hearings, Patriarca was summoned to testify before the McClellan Committee. He sat across the table from Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy. He had been called to answer questions about his organization, his activities, his connections. Instead of doing what every sensible criminal did under oath, say as little as possible, deflect, rely on the Fifth Amendment, Raymond Patriarca looked at the two Kennedy brothers and said, with the kind of contempt that only a man who genuinely believed himself untouchable could muster, "You two don't have the brains of a donkey." Some accounts suggest it was even more pointed than that. One source quoted him as saying they didn't have the brains of their retarded sister, a reference to Rosemary Kennedy, John and Robert's older sister, who had been institutionalized after a botched lobotomy in 1941. Whatever the exact words, the effect was the same. Robert Kennedy, who already had organized crime at the top of his agenda, made Raymond Patriarca personally. Kennedy told associates he was going to go after that pig on the hill, referring specifically to Federal Hill in Providence. The full weight of the federal government fell on the Patriarca family. The FBI spent the first part of the 1960s trying to get electronic surveillance into the office on Atwells Avenue. Vince and Teresa described the neighborhood during those years as an armed camp, spotters everywhere. The community organized to detect and report any law enforcement presence. The FBI tried repeatedly to get close enough to plant a listening device and repeatedly failed. Then, Sometime in 1962, they succeeded. From 1962 to 1965, the FBI maintained an electronic bug inside the National Cigarette Service Company on Atwells Avenue. For 3 years, they listened to Raymond Patriarca conduct his business. What they heard was extraordinary. The recordings documented political payoffs flowing to the governor's office in Rhode Island, to state legislators, to judges. They documented the structure and operation of La Cosa Nostra in detail that had never been available to law enforcement before. They documented murders, territorial arrangements, financial operations, and the internal culture of the organization. On one recording, Patriarca was overheard discussing a man who had come to him with a complaint about a disrespectful encounter at a restaurant. Patriarca made a phone call. The matter was resolved. On another, a man displayed a pistol silencer and mentioned he'd paid $300 for it and was arranging to have a few more made. Patriarca appeared to take an interest. On another, a discussion of slugs that could be used in vending machines, whether they'd work in telephones as well. The mundane criminal alongside the grand criminal, all happening in the same building, same afternoon, same desk. He talked about a stolen shipment of Speidel watch bands. He wanted about a dozen for Christmas presents. The recordings gave the FBI an unprecedented window into the world of the Patriarca family. But the legal status of the bugs was questionable. They had been placed without warrants, using what the FBI called national security authority that courts were increasingly skeptical of. The evidentiary value of what was gathered was compromised from the start. But something else was happening in those same years. Something that would have far greater consequences for Patriarca's empire than any wiretap. The FBI was finding its informants. His name was Joseph Barboza. He was born on September 20th, 1932, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, to a family of Portuguese immigrants. And his nickname, the Animal, was not metaphorical. Barboza was a professional light heavyweight boxer in his early adult years. He fought 12 professional bouts and won 8 of them, 5 by knockout. But even before his boxing career had ended, he was building a parallel career as a criminal. Larceny, armed robbery. His first prison sentence came in 1950. In 1953, he led a jailbreak. The thing about Barboza that separated him from ordinary violent criminals was his ambition. He wanted to be part of the Mafia, not as an associate, as a full member. But there was a problem that no amount of demonstrated violence could solve. He wasn't Italian. He wasn't even close. He was Portuguese-American. La Cosa Nostra, this thing of ours, was, by strict tradition and formal rule, restricted to men of Italian descent. Not Italian by culture, not Italian by marriage or association. Italian by blood. Full-blooded Sicilian or Southern Italian ancestry was preferred. Barboza did not qualify, but he could do something that qualified him as essential regardless of his ancestry. He could kill with extraordinary efficiency and without apparent emotional consequence. By 1966, Barboza had admitted to 26 murders. He was one of the most lethal men working in organized crime in New England. He was associated with the Winter Hill Gang through his friendships with men like Buddy McLean and Vincent Jimmy the Bear Flemmy. He was a contractor, hired by various parties, including the Patriarca family, to eliminate targets. During the Boston Irish Gang Wars of the 1960s, the bloody conflict between the McLaughlin Gang of Charlestown and the McLean Gang of Somerville that produced roughly 50 deaths over nearly a decade, Barboza worked on behalf of the Italian Mafia's interests. Patriarca had decided to back the McLean faction against the McLaughlins, calculating the unified, Mafia-line gang structure in Boston was better than ongoing chaos. Barboza was one of the instruments of that calculation. He drove what law enforcement called the James Bond car, a 1965 Oldsmobile Cutlass equipped with a sophisticated alarm system and a device for generating thick black smoke from the tailpipe to evade pursuit. And in 1966, it all unraveled. Police pulled Barboza over and discovered an arsenal of weapons in his vehicle. He was arrested and charged. His bail was set at $100,000, an astronomical sum for the time. He expected Patriarca to post it. Patriarca refused. Worse than refused, When some of Barbosa's associates managed to raise more than $80,000 toward his bail, Patriarca had 3 of them killed and their money taken. Let that sit for a moment. The man who had killed 26 people on behalf of the Mafia's interests was sitting in jail, and the boss he'd served refused to help him. And when his friends tried to help him themselves, they were murdered for it. Barbosa's fury was incandescent. The FBI had been trying to develop Barbosa as an informant for over a year. Agent H, Paul Rico, had been cultivating him carefully, understanding that a man of Barbosa's knowledge and disposition, if turned, could provide testimony against Patriarca that no other source could match. Now, in a jail cell, with his boss refusing to pay his bail and his friends dead, Barbosa made a decision. He became a government witness. He would be the first person ever placed in the Federal Witness Protection Program. He would testify in multiple trials. He would provide the foundation for prosecutions that the FBI had been unable to build through any other means. And in 1967, Raymond Patriarca was indicted for murder conspiracy. In 1970, he was convicted. He would receive a 10-year prison sentence and be sent to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. But before we get to what Barbosa's testimony produced and what it concealed, we need to talk about the most shameful chapter in the history of the FBI in New England. On the night of March 12, 1965, in an alley behind the Lincoln National Bank in Chelsea, Massachusetts, a small-time hoodlum named Edward Teddy Deegan was shot 6 times with 3 different guns. Deegan was not an important man. He was a burglar, a career criminal of no particular standing in the hierarchy of New England organized crime. He stole things. He associated with dangerous people. He was not someone whose death would generate much official attention. But what surrounded his murder and what the FBI did in its aftermath would eventually produce the largest wrongful conviction settlement in American history, destroy reputations, send a federal agent to prison for murder, and force the government of the United States to acknowledge that it had knowingly allowed innocent men to die in prison to protect its own informants. The FBI knew Teddy Deegan was going to be murdered. Let that register fully. Not a suspicion, not a rumor, knowledge. A memorandum written by FBI Agent H, Paul Rico, dated March 10, 1965, 2 days before the killing, documented that informants had reported that Joseph Barbosa and Vincent Jimmy the Bear Flemmy had contacted Raymond Patriarca to get his approval for the killing. Another informant reported that Flemmy believed Patriarca had given the authorization, that a dry run had already been conducted. The FBI knew the who, the approximate when, and had the names of the men who were going to do it. They did nothing. They did not warn Deegan. They did not arrest Barbosa or Flemmy on a pretext. They did not take any action that would have prevented a man from being shot 6 times in an alley behind a bank in Chelsea, Massachusetts. Why? Because Jimmy Flemmy was an FBI informant. His brother Stephen, the rifleman, Flemmy would later become one of the most important informants in FBI history, a source who would help dismantle the Angulo operation and provide information on the Patriarca family for decades. The FBI considered the Flemmy brothers far too valuable to expose over a single murder. Deegan's death was, as a federal judge would later phrase it with devastating precision, collateral damage. The murder happened, the case went unsolved, and then the FBI recruited Barbosa as an informant, and Barbosa, who had helped kill Deegan alongside Jimmy Flemmy, was given the opportunity to testify about who had done it. Barbosa had a problem. He had told the FBI early on that he would never testify against Jimmy Flemmy. Flemmy was his friend. "I won't give Jimmy to you," was how he reportedly phrased it to his handlers. So when Barbosa testified about the Deegan murder, he protected his friend by replacing him with 4 men who hadn't been there: Peter Limwan, Joseph Salvati, Henry Tamlio, Louis Greco. The FBI knew the testimony was false. They had at least 20 separate pieces of evidence, informant reports, surveillance recordings, direct intelligence, that contradicted Barbosa's story. Agent H, Paul Rico, and his partner Dennis Condon withheld every single piece of it. When state prosecutors asked whether they checked out Barbosa's account, Rico and Condon told them yes. They told them the story was solid. It was not solid. It was a lie constructed to send innocent men to die. The trial was in 1968. The jury deliberated. The verdict came back. Peter Limwan, guilty, sentenced to death. Louis Greco, guilty, sentenced to death. Henry Tamlio, guilty, sentenced to death. Joseph Salvati, guilty, sentenced to life in prison. The death sentences were later commuted to life when the Supreme Court struck down capital punishment in 1972. But the men remained in prison. Henry Tamlio died in prison in 1985. He had spent 18 years behind bars for a murder that FBI agents knew he had not committed. He died without ever seeing freedom again. Louis Greco died in prison in 1995. 28 years. His family fought for years to clear his name. He died before it happened. Joseph Salvati spent more than 29 years in prison. He was finally released in 1997 when his sentence was commuted. He had a wife. He had children who had grown up visiting him in prison. He missed decades of their lives. Peter Lim spent 33 years in prison. 33 years. He was freed in 2001. In 2007, federal judge Nancy Gertner delivered her verdict in the civil lawsuit brought by the survivors and the families of those who had died. She held that the FBI had been the direct cause of these wrongful convictions, that agents had knowingly allowed Barboza to commit perjury, that they had withheld evidence for decades, that 2 men had died in prison as a direct result of the FBI's deliberate actions. She ordered the government to pay $101.75 million in damages. It was at the time the largest wrongful conviction settlement in American history. Gertner awarded $26 million to Lim, $29 million to Salvati, $13 million to Tamilio's estate, $28 million to Greco's estate. 2 men had died in prison for a crime they didn't commit. The FBI knew they were innocent from the day of their arrest. The FBI covered it up for 40 years. And the agents responsible, H. Paul Rico and Dennis Condon, had been commended for their work on the case. They had received bonuses. Director Hoover had sent personal letters of praise. H. Paul Rico was eventually arrested in 2003, not for what he'd done to Lim, Salvati, Tamlio, and Greco, but for an entirely separate murder conspiracy in Tulsa, Oklahoma, involving a businessman named Roger Wheeler. Rico died in state custody in 2004, awaiting trial. At a congressional hearing investigating the FBI's conduct in New England, a committee member asked Rico how he felt about Joseph Salvati spending 30 years in prison for a murder he hadn't committed. Rico's response, rendered with apparent indifference, was, "What do you want? Tears." This is part of the Patriarca story, not a sidebar, not a footnote. The FBI's war against the Patriarca family produced one of the most profound institutional betrayals in the history of American law enforcement. The bureau that was supposed to represent justice framed innocent men, protected killers, covered up its misconduct for 4 decades, and when confronted, expressed something very close to contempt for the consequences. The Patriarca Crime Family was evil. They ordered murders. They extorted people. They corrupted institutions. They terrorized communities. But the story of their destruction is also the story of the agency that destroyed them, and what that agency was willing to do and to cover up and to destroy in the process. While the Deegan murder and its consequences were unfolding, the streets of Boston were experiencing a different kind of violence, one that would eventually reshape the criminal landscape of New England in ways Raymond Patriarca could not have fully anticipated. The Irish gang wars began on Labor Day weekend, 1961. The precise triggering incident has been described in various ways by various participants, all of whom had reasons to shade the truth. The basic framework was this. At a summer gathering in Salisbury Beach, New Hampshire, something happened between associates of George McLaughlin, a member of the Charlestown-based McLaughlin gang, and members of the Somerville-based McLean gang, led by James Buddy McLean. By some accounts, McLaughlin behaved badly toward someone's wife or girlfriend. By McLaughlin's own account, the offense was different. Whatever happened, Buddy McLean ended up beating George McLaughlin severely. McLaughlin went to the hospital. His brothers, Bernie and Punchy and others, responded by demanding McLean's death. McLean refused to give them what they wanted by dying. He survived a car bomb attack on his vehicle, and the war was on. Over the following 4 years, the conflict produced roughly 50 deaths. The list of victims included gang members, associates, bystanders, At least one person who had misfortune to be in the wrong place at a very wrong time. The killing was regular enough that Boston newspapers began keeping running tallies. The Patriarca family and the Angiulo brothers watched this with the calculating attention of men who had interests on every side. Patriarca's conclusion was that the chaos was bad for business. The gang wars were attracting law enforcement attention to the entire Boston underworld. Money from the rackets was being neglected as men went into hiding or focused on survival rather than work. He threatened to declare martial law, to impose the Mafia's authority over the Irish conflict by force. He also made a choice. He decided to back the McLean faction, the Winter Hill Gang, against the McLaughlins. His calculation was that a unified, Mafia-aligned Irish organization in Boston was better for everyone than ongoing civil war. His enforcer, Larry Zunino, was involved in the killing of McLaughlin faction members. Joe Barboza was deployed as a hitman on behalf of the strategic interest. The Angiulos claimed to have personally eliminated 20 McLaughlin-aligned figures to help bring the war to an end. By 1965, the McLaughlin faction had been effectively annihilated. Buddy McLean was the winner. And then in October 1965, Buddy McLean was murdered. A man named Howard Winter eventually took over the remnants of the McLean organization. And when Winter was eventually imprisoned in 1979 on a horse race fixing case, the gang fell to two men who had been working their way toward the top for years, James Whitey Bulger and his partner Stephen, the rifleman Flemmy, the same Flemmy who had been an FBI informant since the mid-1960s, the same Flemmy who had helped kill Teddy Deegan, the same Flemmy who was, by the late 1970s, providing information to FBI agent John Connolly that would eventually help dismantle the Angiulo brothers, the very men he and Patriarca had aligned themselves with. The web was already being woven. It would take another decade for it to fully reveal itself. In March 1969, Raymond Patriarca surrendered to begin his federal prison sentence. He was 61 years old. He had heart disease. He had diabetes. He was, by any objective measure, a man whose health was not suited to the rigors of federal incarceration. He went to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. While he was there, serving time on the Willie Marfio murder conspiracy, a Rhode Island court handed him an additional 10-year sentence for conspiracy to kill Marfio's brother Rudolph and Anthony Malei. The two men shot to death while shopping in a Providence grocery store in April 1968. He completed his federal sentence in April 1973. He was transferred to a Rhode Island state facility and paroled on January 9, 1975. 6 years. 6 years in prison. And for every one of those 6 years, the Patriarca family continued operating without interruption. Gennaro Angiulo ran the Boston operations. Trusted lieutenants in Providence maintained order. Money continued to flow. Protection payments continued to be collected. Disputes continued to be resolved. New members continued to be induced. Patriarca ran his organization from inside a federal cell the way a chief executive runs a company, through remote management, through established procedures, through trusted lieutenants, through the absolute confidence that his word carried the same weight from a prison block in Atlanta as it did from a desk on Atwells Avenue. He walked back into that office in 1975 as if nothing had interrupted his tenure. The family respected him for this, though respect in that world always had an element of fear mixed into it. The king had survived prison. The king had returned. But the world had changed while he was gone. The FBI had changed. The tools of federal law enforcement had been sharpened by exactly the kind of long, patient investigation that the Patriarca case had become, and the men who would eventually destroy the empire he'd built were already in position. Every powerful man in any institution generates legends. Some are true, some are exaggerated. All of them serve a purpose. They reinforce the authority of the figure at the center. They clarify the consequences of betrayal or failure. They remind everyone in the organization of the standards they're expected to meet. The stories told about Raymond Patriarca were particularly vivid. There was a story of the elderly mobster and his son. The son had been involved in a bad deal that cost Patriarca a substantial sum of money. Patriarca's response was not merely to punish the son, which would have been expected. His response was to summon the father. The elderly man, who had spent his entire adult life in service to the organization, was told that his son's transgression required the ultimate price. Patriarca allegedly ordered the father to kill his own son. The father begged, on his knees reportedly, pleading for his son's life. Invoking every possible appeal, years of service, the code of the family, mercy. Underboss Henry Tamlio intervened. He persuaded Patriarca to relent. The son was exiled rather than killed. The story spread through the organization immediately and completely. Its message was clear. Raymond Patriarca could order a father to kill his son. The natural bonds of human affection, the deepest connections most people could imagine, were not protection. They were not exemptions. They existed completely beneath the authority of the organization. There was the story of the hijacked cigarettes. Federal authorities had seized a truckload of stolen cigarettes that Patriarca had personally financed. The shipment was gone. The investment was lost. Patriarca's response was to demand that every member of the crew involved pay him $22,000 out of their own pockets. It didn't matter that the seizure was the result of law enforcement action rather than individual negligence. It didn't matter that the men had done everything right and simply been caught. Patriarca had lost money. Someone was going to make that right. There was a story, told in the lowest of voices, that Patriarca had ordered the murder of his own brother. When the FBI planted a bug in the Coin-O-Matic office in the early 1960s, there was a question of how it had been missed in whatever security sweeps the organization conducted. Joseph Patriarca, Raymond's brother, had some responsibility for security at the office. According to multiple sources who were never entirely consistent about the details, Raymond allegedly ordered his brother's death in response to this failure. Whether the order was carried out, whether the story is even entirely accurate, remains uncertain. What is certain is that people believed it. And the fact that they believed it, that no one in the organization found it implausible that a man would order the murder of his own blood relative for a security failure, tells you everything about the climate Raymond Patriarca had created. In that organization, under that boss, nothing was sacred. Nothing was exempt. The code was absolute. The price of failure was absolute. Through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, Raymond Patriarca's physical condition deteriorated steadily. Heart disease, diabetes, the amputation of a gangrenous toe, a man who had once walked the streets of Providence without a bodyguard, projecting absolute physical and psychological authority, was now managing serious chronic illness. In 1980, he was arrested again, this time for allegedly setting up 2 murders. His lawyer mounted a successful argument that his health was too poor to withstand a trial. The judge accepted it. The charges were effectively stayed. In 1981, he was indicted for conspiring to seize control of a Labor's International Union insurance operation in the Northeast, the kind of institutional corruption that had always been a signature of Patriarca's reach into legitimate institutions. In December 1983, at the age of 75, he was charged with ordering the 1965 murder of Raymond "Baby Ray" Curcio, a Providence mobster who had committed the remarkable offense of robbing Patriarca's brother's house. Curcio was reckless. He was drug addicted, and he apparently lacked the self-preservation instincts that would have prevented a sensible person from stealing from the family of the man who ran New England organized crime. The charge came too late to go to trial. Patriarca's health was failing rapidly. In the spring of 1984, Raymond Patriarca made a decision that would define the next decade of the family's history. He named his son as his successor. The choice was controversial. Some within the organization believed that other figures, Nicholas Bianco, Joseph Russo, were better suited to leadership. Some felt that Junior, while loyal and well-connected to his father's relationships, simply did not have the qualities required. The National Commission, with the backing of the Gambino family, approved the succession. Junior was confirmed. It was one of the last decisions Raymond Patriarca Sr. made. And some people who loved the old man's legacy would later say it was his greatest mistake. On the morning of July 11th, 1984, at around 11:30 in the morning, emergency services in North Providence received a call from a Douglas Avenue address. The address, it was later revealed, was the home of his girlfriend. Patriarca's first wife, Helen, had died in 1965. He had eventually remarried and later taken up with a companion in North Providence. When the rescue squad arrived, they found Raymond Patriarca in full cardiac arrest. He was rushed to Rhode Island Hospital. Doctors worked frantically. Electrical shock, a cardiac pacemaker implanted in a last-ditch effort to restart the stalled machinery of his heart. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Raymond Laredo Salvatore Patriarca was pronounced dead. He was 76 years old. The Boston Globe noted, with a particular kind of poetic accuracy, in a business where violent death is often inevitable, Patriarca died relatively peacefully, unable to outweat failing health caused by a heart condition and diabetes. He was buried at Gate of Heaven Cemetery in East Providence, Rhode Island. The king was dead, and everything he had built, slowly, patiently, over 30 years of absolute control, was about to begin its long unraveling. Before we can understand how the Patriarca family fell, we need to understand Whitey Bulger. And before we can understand Whitey Bulger, we need to understand John Connolly. John Joseph Connolly Jr. was born on August 1st, 1940, in Boston, Massachusetts. He grew up in the Old Harbor Housing Project in South Boston, a working-class Irish neighborhood. The kind of place where loyalty to your block to your family, was the organizing principle of daily life. As a child, Connolly looked up to a neighborhood figure considerably older than himself, a teenager named James Whitey Bulger, who was already notorious as the leader of a local street gang, once bought the neighborhood kids ice cream and chased away some older boys who were giving Connolly trouble. Connolly never forgot it. He joined the FBI in 1968. He built a career that led him back to Boston by 1972, when he arrested mob figure Frank Salem in New York, a collar that impressed his superiors and got him the transfer home he wanted. In 1975, Connolly leveraged their shared South Boston background to recruit Bulger as an FBI informant. The pitch Connolly made to Bulger was straightforward. The FBI wanted information about the Patriarca family, specifically about the Angiulo brothers. In exchange for providing that information, the FBI would give Bulger protection. It was a deal. What the deal actually produced over the following 20 years was one of the most catastrophic institutional corruptions in the history of American law enforcement. Bulger and his partner Stephen Flemmi, who had been an informant since the mid-1960s, were designated as top echelon informants. This was the FBI's highest status for criminal sources, reserved for those with direct access to organized crime leadership. It came with significant protections. Information developed against Bulger and Flemmi through the FBI's own investigations was quietly buried. Indictments that touched them were made to disappear. Other criminals who were becoming FBI informants against Bulger were identified in by Connolly and subsequently murdered. Connolly's supervisor, John Morris, was also compromised. He accepted cash payments from Bulger. He accepted expensive gifts. He joined the relationship fully enough that he would later tell another agent, with what sounds in retrospect like shameless candor, that they had destroyed the Angiulos in exchange for a gang of two, Whitey Bulger and Stevie Flemmi. The FBI had traded one mafia organization for an Irish criminal empire that, protected by federal corruption, would prove considerably more dangerous and more violent than what it replaced. Bulger later summed up his relationship with FBI intelligence in a way that has become one of the most quoted assessments in the history of organized crime. Me and Whitey gave them shit, and they gave us gold. By 1980, the FBI had a problem. They knew the Angiulo brothers were running a $250,000 a week criminal empire in Boston. They knew it in general terms, from informant reports and surveillance. But what they needed to build a RICO case that would survive federal prosecution was specific conversations, plans, evidence of specific criminal acts. The solution was electronic surveillance inside the Angiulo brothers' headquarters at 98 Prince Street in the North End. Getting a bug inside 98 Prince Street was extraordinarily difficult. The North End was, like Federal Hill in Providence, a tight-knit Italian community where strangers were noticed and where the culture of silence ran deep. The Angiulo brothers had been operating out of that same block since their parents had run a grocery store there in the 1940s. Everyone on the street knew them. Everyone on the street understood the implicit rules about who you talked to and what you said. The FBI needed help from someone who knew the layout, Someone who had been inside and could describe exactly where the furniture was, where the men sat, where a device placed in what location would capture the most conversation. They asked Bulger and Flemmy. It was later revealed in federal court proceedings that Whitey Bulger and Stephen Flemmy had drawn a diagram for FBI agents. A detailed floor plan of the Angulo headquarters, showing furniture placement, seating arrangements, the patterns of daily activity. A map made by two men who had every reason to want the Angulos destroyed and no reason, from their perspective, not to provide it. In January 1981, working in the early morning hours, FBI agents picked a lock at 98 Prince Street and entered the building. They planted listening devices in precise locations. They exited before dawn. For 103 days, the FBI listened. What they heard was extraordinary in its completeness and its candor. Gennaro Angulo, who had spent 20 years operating as one of the most sophisticated criminal organizers in Boston history, was not particularly careful about what he said inside his own headquarters. He apparently believed, as many mob figures of his generation did, that the code of omerta among his own people was sufficient protection, that no one in his organization would betray him, that the walls of 98 Prince Street were, in effect, a confession booth with no priest on the other side. He was wrong about all of it. During one taped conversation, Angulo said to one of his brothers, "I wouldn't be in legitimate business for all the fucking money in the world. We're Shylock. We're a fucking bookmaker. We're selling marijuana. We're illegal here, illegal there, arsonists. We're every fucking thing." It was a prosecutorial dream, not an inference, not circumstantial evidence. The man himself, in his own voice, describing his own crimes. The recordings captured discussions of 6 murders. They captured mechanics of loan sharking operations, the rates, the collection methods, the consequences for non-payment. They captured gambling operations in detail that allowed investigators to map the entire enterprise. They captured the texture of daily criminal life in the Angulo operation in a way that no informant testimony could have matched. The conversations also captured something unexpected. Larry Zunino, the brutal enforcer who sat near the top of the Boston faction, discussing with Angulo the murder of Joseph Barboza, which had been carried out in San Francisco in 1976. Zunino explained how it had been done. He described Barboza's route to set up the execution. "We clipped Barboza. I was with him every day." Zunino told Angulo, referring to his partner in the killing, Joseph Russo. He made snap decisions. There, he couldn't get in touch with nobody, and he accomplished the whole pot. The FBI now had confirmation of a 1976 murder from the mouth of one of the men who'd ordered it. The case was built. The warrants were prepared. The prosecutors were ready. On the evening of September 19, 1983, FBI agents moved to the north end of Boston with precision. Gennaro Angulo was at a restaurant. He was eating dinner. He was, by all accounts, relaxed. The kind of relax that comes from believing wrongly that you are entirely secure. FBI agents walked in. They placed him in handcuffs. As they led him out of the restaurant and into the waiting cars, Angulo looked over his shoulder at the table he was leaving. His dinner was still there. His pork chops, presumably, were still warm. He said, "I'll be back before my pork chops get cold." He was not back. His brothers Donato, Michelle, and Francesco were arrested simultaneously at other locations. 3 other associates were also taken in. 20 federal racketeering counts. 6 gangland killings. Gambling. Loan sharking. Extortion. Obstruction of justice. The bail hearings were remarkable for their theater. Angulo, a man who had spent decades projecting power and authority, tried to maintain his composure. When the prosecutor, Jeremiah O'Sullivan from the Justice Department's Organized Crime Strike Force, entered the courtroom, Angulo called out, "Hey, Jerry, don't you say hello?" The magistrate set no bail for Angulo. The others received bail requirements between $500,000 and $1 million. Angulo's immediate comment on hearing the bail denial was a joke about not being dressed appropriately for the hearing. The case took 3 years to prosecute, largely because the volume of evidence was staggering. When the verdict came in February 1986, Angulo was convicted on 12 counts. The sentence was 45 years in federal prison and a fine of $120,000. He also forfeited his 68-foot yacht, his Nahant mansion, several $1 million in property. At sentencing, Angulo filed an affidavit arguing that a 45-year sentence at his age was tantamount to an illegal death sentence. He was not wrong about the math. He served more than 2 decades. He was paroled in September 2007 at the age of 88, having spent his final years in the federal prison hospital at Devon's undergoing dialysis treatment. He died 2 years later, in 2009. Massachusetts State Police Colonel Thomas Foley described him as probably the last very significant mafia boss in Boston's history. With the Angulo brothers arrested and awaiting trial, with the Boston faction, the Patriarca family, in structural disarray, a power vacuum had opened in the criminal landscape of the city. Whitey Bulger was ready. Bulger and Fleming moved quickly to establish control over gambling and loan sharking operations that the Angulos had previously dominated. They were helped systematically by Connolly, who continued to provide them with information about ongoing FBI investigations, continued to identify other informants who were providing intelligence on the Winter Hill Gang, continued to manipulate the FBI's internal reporting to protect his sources. At least 2 people who were becoming informants against Bulger were identified to him by Connolly. They were murdered. The FBI had set out to destroy Italian organized crime in Boston. It had, in the process, created an Irish criminal organization with more protection from law enforcement, more institutional insulation, more ability to commit crimes without consequence than the Italian Mafia had ever enjoyed. And in Providence, Raymond Patriarca was dying. The man who had held the 2 factions together, Boston and Providence, through the force of his personality and the absolute clarity of his authority, was watching from a distance, increasingly incapacitated, as his underboss was arrested and his city was reorganized by people he could no longer control. He died in July 1984, and then the sun sat down at the desk. Raymond Patriarca Jr. was born on February 24th, 1945. He was 40 years old when his father died. He had grown up watching one of the most powerful men in American organized crime conduct his business, manage his subordinates, make his decisions. He had absorbed a great deal. He understood the culture. He understood the hierarchy. He understood what was expected, what he apparently did not possess, or did not possess in sufficient quantity to meet the moment, was a quality that had made his father irreplaceable. That specific combination of cold intelligence, absolute ruthlessness, political cunning, and iron discipline that had allowed Raymond Sr. to hold an empire together for 30 years. The federal judge who presided over one of the cases against Jr. would describe him, in a formal judicial assessment, as someone who had no penchant or personal aptitude for violence, who seemed, at the 1989 induction ceremony that would prove his undoing, to genuinely believe that Mafia membership was not a ticket to abuse people. These are not the qualities of a man built for this particular job. The succession battle was also complicated. Gennaro Angulo, imprisoned but not yet convicted, made a bid for leadership from his jail cell. He believed his decades of service, his financial contributions, his status as underboss gave him a claim. He was wrong about this. Ilario Zunino, the feared Boston enforcer, one of the most respected old guard figures in the family. Back Jr., the National Commission with Gambino family support confirmed Jr.'s position, and Angulo was demoted from underboss, the second position in the entire organization, to soldier, the lowest formal rank in La Cosa Nostra. A Providence police official, watching this unfold, offered a chilling assessment of what the alternative would have been. If that job had gone to Angulo, the official said, we would have bodies all over the place. Jr. inherited a family that was already compromised in ways he could not fully grasp. The FBI's surveillance capabilities had grown. RICO had changed the legal landscape. The informant culture within the organization was spreading, and he lacked the personal authority to enforce the kind of discipline that had kept the old order together. To compensate for what he lacked, Jr. leaned on William Billy the Wild Man Grasso. Grasso was Jr.'s former cellmate. The two had met while both were serving prison time, a detail that said something about the circles Jr. moved in. Grasso was based in East Hartford, Connecticut, and ran the Patriarca family's Connecticut operations. He was also, by virtually every account, genuinely terrifying. Law enforcement officials who tracked the family in the late 1980s believed that Grasso might actually have been running the organization, that Junior's name was on the title, but Grasso held the actual power. Grasso had the kind of willingness to use violence without hesitation or remorse that the organization needed to maintain order, and that Junior apparently could not fully project. The arrangement was unstable. Internal factions within the family, particularly the Boston faction, which had long operated with a degree of autonomy that Providence found uncomfortable, were looking at Junior's weakness and drawing conclusions about what it meant for their own position. In June 1989, Grasso was found dead in Connecticut, shot. His killer was a gangster from Springfield, Massachusetts, with ties to the Genovese family. Evidence that the territorial tensions along the Connecticut River border were boiling over into murder, and that the Patriarca family no longer had the strength to command the kind of respect that prevented this. Grasso's death left Junior more exposed than ever. Nicholas Bianco moved into the underboss position, but the family's authority structure was fragmenting. Boston was effectively challenging Providence's primacy. Internal factions were fighting each other. The testimony of a government witness named John Sonny Castagna, who appeared in a May 1991 trial, captured one moment that illustrated how completely Junior's position had deteriorated. Castagna testified about a conversation with Joseph J.R. Russo, a Boston capo who had become one of Junior's most significant internal rivals. Russo had told Castagna, according to his testimony, that he had confronted Junior directly and threatened his life if he didn't step down. Raymond Jr. had tears in his eyes and he was begging for his life. Castagna quoted Russo as saying, "The son of the man who had once insulted the Kennedy brothers to their faces, who had refused a bodyguard because no one would dare touch him, who had run New England from a vending machine office without fear, was reportedly weeping and begging for his life in front of subordinate." The empire had come to this. Junior decided that the way to restore some sense of unity, to signal a new beginning, to bring factions together, to reaffirm the organizational identity, was a ceremony, a Mafia induction ceremony. Formal, traditional, the kind that had existed in La Cosa Nostra since the organization came to America. New members inducted with blood oaths and holy cards and the ancient rituals of the fraternity. The ceremony would take place at 34 Guild Street in Medford, Massachusetts. The house had been borrowed from the sister of one of the inductees, Vincent Federico, who had received a weekend furlough from a state prison specifically to attend what was described to prison authorities as family business. The four men to be inducted were Federico, Robert, Bobby DeLuca, Richard Floramo, and Carmen Tortora. 21 people were present. Raymond Jr. was there, introduced to the gathering as the boss. Capo Biagio di Giacomo, a Sicilian-born mobster who had administered the oath, was there. Various soldiers, capos, and representatives of the Providence and Boston factions were there. And the FBI was there, not in the room, but in the building across the street, in a house that happened to belong to an FBI agent. The previous night, agents posing as utility workers had entered 34 Guild Street and run a wire from the house to the agent's home. The bug was in place before the ceremony began. A mob soldier named Angelo Sonny Mercurio, who had driven Junior to the meeting, had tipped off FBI agents John Connolly and James Ahern. Mercurio was a cooperating witness. He had told the FBI exactly where the ceremony would be held, and exactly when. At 34 Guild Street. The ceremony proceeded according to ancient tradition. Fingers were pricked. Blood was drawn from the trigger fingers of the new initiates. Holy cards were burned in a small flame, burned to symbolize the destruction of the old life, the beginning of a new. The oath was administered in Italian by Di Giacomo, a formal affirmation of loyalty and secrecy that each man repeated. Junior spoke to the gathered group. "We're all here to bring in some new members into our family," he said, "and more than that, to start maybe a new beginning, put all that's got started behind us, and bygones are bygones and a good future for all of us." He told the new inductees that they had been vouched for, that they had done what was required, that this membership was a serious thing, not a ticket to abuse people, not a license for recklessness, but a commitment to the organization and its values. Everything was recorded, every word, every ritual, every voice identified from comparison recordings. The meeting lasted 5 hours. It was the first and only time in American history that a Mafia induction ceremony was captured in full on audio recording. The FBI had been present for the moment that La Cosa Nostra formally confirmed the existence it had spent decades denying. On March 26, 1990, the United States Department of Justice executed what it described as the most sweeping attack ever launched against a single organized crime family. 21 indictments. Raymond Patriarca Jr., Underboss Nicholas Bianco, Consigliere Joseph Russo, Capos Biagio Di Giacomo, Vincent Ferrara, and Matthew Guglielmetti. Soldiers, associates, the entire visible leadership of the New England family, all brought up at once on charges of racketeering, extortion, narcotics trafficking, gambling, corruption, and murder. The centerpiece of the prosecution was the induction ceremony recording. The FBI played it in court. Jurors and spectators heard the blood oaths, the burning holy cards, the boss speaking to his new soldiers. Every person present at the ceremony was now directly linked to the RICO enterprise that the government was dismantling. Attorney General Richard Thornburg announced the indictments at a press conference and declared that the government had driven a stake in the heart of New England organized crime. Nicholas Bianco and 7 others went to trial in Connecticut. All were convicted. 6 others went to trial in Boston. The case produced a complex mix of convictions, plea agreements, and negotiated sentences. Junior pleaded guilty in December 1991. He had, by this point, also been demoted within the family, from boss to soldier, a consequence of having presided over the ceremony that gave the FBI its most powerful evidence. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. He was released in 1998. He retired from organized crime. He entered the construction business. He kept a very low profile for the rest of his life. In September 2025, Raymond Patriarca Jr. filed a civil lawsuit in Rhode Island State Court. The lawsuit was over a coin collection, worth approximately $1 million, stolen from his home. The once feared name Patriarca appearing in civil court pleadings about coins. When Jr. went to prison, the family needed a new leader. The man who emerged was Francis Cadillac Frank Salem. He was born in Weymouth, Massachusetts, on August 18, 1933. His mother was Irish-American. His father was Italian-American. He grew up in Jamaica Plain, served in the Army during the Korean War, became a licensed electrician after his discharge, and then slid steadily into the criminal world through his association with Stephen Flemmi and the circles around the North End. Salem and Flemmi became such close friends that Salem named his son Stephen after him. This would later prove to be one of the great ironies of his life. Through the 1960s, Salem and Flemmi had worked as enforcers for Ilario Zunino, the brutal Boston capo. They participated in the Irish gang wars. They committed murders. Salem would eventually admit to being involved in 8 killings during the 1960s and was suspected in 6 more during the early 1990s. They were considered for induction into the Patriarca family, which was prepared to waive the usual requirement of a murder on record because they had such comprehensive murder records already. Salem couldn't be formally inducted because of his partial Irish ancestry. Full Italian or Sicilian descent was required. The rule would eventually be relaxed as the family's ranks depleted, and Salem was inducted by Junior in 1988. In 1968, Salem had orchestrated the car bombing of a lawyer named John Fitzgerald, an attorney who was representing Joe Barboza, and whose testimony was seen as a threat to Patriarca's defense. The point was to intimidate Barboza into not testifying. Fitzgerald survived but lost his left leg. Salem was eventually captured by FBI agent John Connolly in New York in 1972. He served 16 years. He came out of prison in 1988 and survived an assassination attempt in 1989, shot outside a pancake restaurant in Saugus. By the time Junior was taken down in the RICO sweep of 1990, Salem was the strongest remaining figure in the family. He took over. He moved the family's base back to Boston, ending the 30-year period of Providence primacy. The early years of the Salem era were extraordinarily violent. Between 1991 and 1992, 6 mob-related murders occurred within or around the organization. Factions that had been kept in line by the credible threat of Patriarca Sr.'s wrath were now operating with a freedom they hadn't had before. The renegade Boston crew led by Robert Carrozza was challenging Salem's authority openly. The family that had once enforced discipline through absolute terror was now experiencing what happened when that discipline failed. In the summer of 1993, a Boston nightclub manager named Stephen DiSarro went missing. DiSarro had been managing a club called The Channel, in which Salem and others had criminal interests. The FBI had contacted DiSarro and told him he was about to be indicted and suggested he cooperate. DiSarro was never seen again. His remains were found in 2016, buried behind a mill-turned apartments in Providence. According to later testimony from Stephen Flemmi, Salem had watched as his own son strangled DiSarro while an accomplice held his legs. Salem was eventually convicted of this murder in 2018. He was sentenced to life in prison. He died in federal custody on December 13, 2022, at the age of 89. But before all of that came the revelation that broke him. In January 1995, a joint task force of the DA, the Massachusetts State Police, and the Boston Police Department executed a sweeping racketeering case. The targets included Francis Salem, Whitey Bulger, Stephen Flemmi, and others. 35 counts. Racketeering, extortion, money laundering. Before the arrests could be made, the indictments were leaked. John Connolly, who had retired from the FBI in 1990 but had never stopped protecting his most valuable source, tipped off Bulger and Salem. On December 23, 1994, Bulger and his companion Teresa Stanley left Boston. They would not return. Bulger would spend 16 years as a fugitive, traveling across North America and Europe, eventually settling in Santa Monica, California, where he lived under a false identity until he was recognized and arrested in June 2011 at the age of 81. Salem also fled. He was captured in Florida several months later. And in the legal proceedings that followed his arrest, Salem was exposed to something he had never fully reckoned with. During the discovery phase of his case, he heard a surveillance recording from a roving FBI bug. In the background of the recording, two agents, discussing something unrelated, mentioned offhandedly that they should have told one of their informants to prepare a list of questions. Salem began asking questions. His attorneys began digging, and what they found was that Stephen Flemmi, his closest friend, the man he had named his son after, the man he had considered his brother in every way that mattered, had been working as an FBI informant since the mid-1960s. Through the gang wars, through the Angulo operation, through the years when the Winter Hill Gang was building its power on the ruins of the Italian Mafia, Flemmi had been feeding information to the FBI. Information about Salem. Information about the Patriarca family. Information about everyone around him. Salem's response was, in retrospect, predictable. He had been a man of the old code, omerta, loyalty, blood over everything. The discovery that the man he trusted most in the world had been systematically betraying him and everyone around him for 30 years was not something he could absorb without rupturing completely. He cooperated. He pleaded guilty. He agreed to provide information to the government. He testified against John Connolly in 2002. His testimony was central to Connolly's conviction for racketeering and obstruction of justice. Connolly was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. And that wasn't the end of his legal troubles. In 2005, he was indicted on murder charges in Florida for his role in providing information that led to the killings of Roger Wheeler and John Callahan. He was convicted in 2008 of second-degree murder in Miami and sentenced to 40 years. The FBI agent who had been celebrated for destroying the Angulos. The agent who received commendations and was praised by his colleagues. The agent who built a career on the fiction that his relationship with Whitey Bulger was a legitimate intelligence asset rather than a criminal partnership, convicted of murder, serving a 40-year sentence. The Patriarca Family was a criminal organization. John Connolly was a federal agent who had sworn an oath to uphold the law. By the end of it, the agent had committed crimes the gangsters hadn't. While Salem was dealing with the revelation of Flemmi's betrayal and preparing for his own prosecution, the Boston faction of the family was experiencing its own internal warfare. Robert Carrozza led a crew of Boston mobsters who had been operating with increasing independence throughout the early 1990s. His faction challenged Salem's authority and pursued its own interests without coordination or deference to the leadership structure. In 1997, Carrozza and 14 associates were indicted. More prison terms, more guilty pleas, more men who had taken blood oaths now calculating the mathematics of cooperation, how many years they could trade for how much information. The decade of the 1990s was the decade the Patriarca family ate itself. Bosses flipped. Allies disappeared. The informants multiplied. Every investigation produced new pressure. Every prosecution produced new cooperating witnesses. The code of silence, the absolute bedrock of everything the family had been built on, the code that Raymond Patriarca had enforced with such terrifying consistency, was now honored more in the breach than in the observance. Luigi Louis Manocchio took over as boss in 1996, returning the family center of gravity to Providence. Manocchio was old school, careful, discreet, a man who avoided attention and maintained the traditional structures. But he was leading an organization that was a shadow of what it had been. The FBI's assessment was already changing. This was no longer a family that needed to be treated as a national threat. This was an organization that needed to be monitored, occasionally investigated, and when it produced prosecutable conduct, prosecuted. But it was no longer an empire. Carmen Raymond D'Annunzio was born into a federal North End family that had long existed on the margins of the Patriarca organization. During the 1980s, Carmen and his brother Anthony had been low-level figures connected to the Angiulo operation. The relationship had actually soured when Carmen allegedly tried to extort one of Angiulo's protégés, a transgression that reportedly put a contract on the D'Annunzio brothers' heads. They fled to Las Vegas and Los Angeles, where they worked for the Chicago outfit, bookmakers, and debt collectors operating under another family's umbrella because their relationship with their home organization had become homicidal. After the fall of Angiulo and the chaos of the 1990s, the D'Annunzios came home. The men who wanted them dead were gone or imprisoned. The landscape had changed, and Carmen, patient and adaptable, positioned himself in the vacuum. By the early 2000s, D'Annunzio was a recognized leader of the Boston faction. His nickname, the Cheese Man, came from his family's legitimate food distribution business in the North End. Like the Angiulos before him, he operated out of a neighborhood grocery and food business, the legitimate commerce of the Italian North End providing cover for the less legitimate commerce of organized crime. The family D'Annunzio led was very different from what it had been at its peak. Gone were the days of the National Commission seat. Gone were the Las Vegas casino stakes, the $2 billion gambling networks, the armies of made men controlling entire cities. By the mid-2000s, the Patriarca family was estimated at fewer than 40 made members. Some assessments put the number lower. The rackets had contracted. The territory had shrunk. The political connections that had allowed Patriarca Sr. to walk out of prison sentences and bend governors and judges to who had been severed by decades of FBI investigation, RICO prosecutions, and the simple passage of time. What remained was recognizable as a mafia family in the way that a photograph of a building is recognizable as a building. You can see the structure, you can identify the elements, but the life is missing. In 2010, Carmen D'Annunzio was involved in an extortion scheme targeting strip clubs in Rhode Island. He was working with members of the Gambino crime family from New York. The target was bar and club owners who'd been told, in the traditional organized crime manner, that they needed to pay for protection, that certain unpleasant things might happen if they didn't. This was not sophisticated criminal enterprise. This was a crude end of organized crime. The same kind of shakedown that Patriarca Sr. had been running on Federal Hill merchants in the 1930s, when he was a young man building his reputation. The same protection racket, the same implied threat. But the FBI was watching, and the surveillance produced evidence that was, once again, damning in its completeness. In 2011, a recording captured D'Annunzio telling an associate something that sounded like a line from a mob movie. "I get to watch you die in the ground." The language of the old days, the implied violence, the confidence that came from having power. Except the FBI had it on tape. On April 25, 2012, D'Annunzio was arrested on racketeering and extortion charges. On September 13, 2012, he pleaded guilty. On November 14, 2012, He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. At the time of his sentencing, the most striking fact in the coverage wasn't the charges or the sentence. It was a number that appeared almost as a parenthetical in news reports. The Patriarca family, it was estimated, had approximately 30 made members. 30 in the 1960s and 1970s. The family had had more soldiers in a single crew than that. The entire organization that Raymond Patriarca Sr. had built. The empire that had touched Las Vegas and sat on the National Commission and controlled the fates of thousands of people across 6 New England states had been reduced to 30 men. D'Annunzio was released from prison on February 17, 2015. He had served 5.5 years. And according to law enforcement intelligence gathered in the following months, one of his first significant acts upon release was to hold an induction ceremony in the basement of a North End restaurant. The inductees reportedly include his own nephew, Louis D'Annunzio, who acquired the obvious nickname Baby Cheese, along with 2 associates named Johnny Scarpelli and Salvatore Tea Party Tormarino. Acting boss Anthony Spucky Spagnolo was present. Providence capo Matthew Guglielmetti was present. D'Annunzio's bodyguard, Gregory Fat Boy Costa, was promoted to capo of the North End crew at the same event. The ceremony was the same ceremony that had been performed for nearly 100 years. Blood oaths, loyalty pledges, the burning of a holy card, the ancient ritual of La Cosa Nostra, conducted with the same solemnity it had always commanded. 3 new members, in a restaurant basement, for a family with 30 made men in total. The contrast with the Medford ceremony of 1989, 21 people attending, the boss of the family presiding, the full hierarchy present, was stark. The contrast of the ceremonies of the Patriarca Senior era, when inductions were events of genuine organizational significance, was even starker. But the ceremony was performed anyway, with seriousness, with the old words, with the rituals intact. Because for men who had dedicated their lives to this identity, to being made members of La Cosa Nostra, part of the tradition that stretched back to Sicily, the code that had defined their existence, the ceremony still meant something, even in a basement, even for 3 new members, even when the empire above them had largely collapsed. Some traditions persist not because they are powerful, but because the people who practice them cannot imagine being without them. In October 2022, something happened that illustrated, with almost perfect clarity, both how diminished the Patriarca family had become and how the essential patterns of organized crime persist even in reduced circumstances. John Connie, the senior deputy chief of staff in the Rhode Island State House, one of the most senior staffers in the state government, resigned from his position. The reason? Allegations that he was a silent partner in a marijuana growing operation with a man named Raymond Scarface Jenkins, who was described in state police reports as a Patriarca family associate. A state police probe had revealed that Connie and Jenkins share an interest in something called Organic Bees marijuana growing operation, which had started in 2017 and was shut down in 2022 when the 2 refused to disclose their involvement. Surveillance recordings showed them meeting outside the State House in December 2020, talking for approximately 20 minutes. The former chief of staff had also been photographed and recorded at a 2020 Christmas party at a Providence restaurant attended by Connie, Providence capo Matthew Guglielmetti, and family underboss Edward Lotto. The FBI noted this. The state police investigated. Connie resigned. It was a different kind of corruption than the kind Raymond Patriarca Sr. had practiced. No governors being manipulated. No judges receiving envelopes. A state house staffer and a mob associate growing marijuana. A Christmas party. A surveillance photo. But the essential pattern was recognizable. The Patriarca family was still reaching into legitimate institutions, still cultivating relationships with people who had access to power, still, in whatever diminished form, practicing the craft that the family had been built on. The river still ran, just not at the same depth. In late 2024, the Boston field office of the FBI made a decision that was, in its own understated way, the most definitive assessment of the Patriarca family's current state. The Boston Organized Crime Squad was disbanded, not merged with another unit, not restructured, disbanded. The dedicated FBI squad that had spent decades pursuing the Patriarca family, that had planted the bugs in Angiulo's headquarters, that had recorded the Medford induction ceremony, that had built the RICO cases that produced dozens of convictions was no longer considered necessary. Former Massachusetts State Police Detective Lieutenant Steve Johnson offered an assessment that would have been unimaginable 50 years earlier. The family, he said, was a shell of itself, with a membership consisting of mostly figurehead people and wannabes. Figurehead people and wannabes. This was the official assessment of the federal law enforcement community regarding the organization that Raymond Patriarca Sr. had built to a position of national power. On August 23, 2024, Edward Lotto died of natural causes at the age of 77. He had been the family's underboss in Providence, having survived a heart attack and undergone cancer treatment in his final years. His death went largely unnoticed outside of law enforcement circles. On December 8, 2024, Luigi Louis Manocchio died in Bristol, Rhode Island. He was 97 years old. Manocchio had been one of the most remarkable figures in the later history of the Patriarca family. He had served as boss from 1996 until around 2004, returning the family's leadership to Providence after the chaos of the Salem era. He was old school in ways that even the old school men around him recognized as exceptional. Patient, discreet, rooted in the traditional culture of Federal Hill in a way that connected him directly to the era of Raymond Sr. In 1969, Manocchio had gone into hiding in Europe after being charged with involvement in the murder of 2 bookmakers in Silver Lake. He returned to Providence a decade later, turned himself in, served 2 years, and had a conviction overturned. He lived above a restaurant on Atwells Avenue in his final years. He was known for his ties to Federal Hill, for his quiet presence in the neighborhood, for being one of the last men who remembered what it looked like at its height. He died at 97, quietly, at the Rhode Island Veterans Home in Bristol. And then on September 21st, 2025, the same date on which Gaspar DeCola, the original boss of the Boston family, had been murdered 109 years earlier, Carmen the Cheese Man D'Annunzio died. He was 68 years old. Natural causes. The last recognizable boss of the Patriarca Crime Family was gone. And that September 21st date, a coincidence that has the quality of something designed, though is almost certainly nothing more than calendar accident, marks the beginning and then an arc that stretched across more than a century of American criminal history. September 21st, 1916, Gaspar DeCola murdered in Boston. The beginning. September 21st, 2025, Carmen D'Annunzio dies of natural causes. The end. 109 years. In the same month that D'Annunzio died, September 2025, Raymond Patriarca Jr. filed a civil lawsuit in Rhode Island State Court. The lawsuit concerned his personal coin collection. The collection was worth approximately $1 million. It had been stolen from his home. He wanted it back, or the value of it, or both. The son of Raymond Patriarca Sr., the man who had once run Las Vegas casino operations and held a seat on the National Commission of the American Mafia, the man who had insulted the Kennedy brothers to their faces and run an empire from a vending machine office that generated revenues in the billions, was filing civil papers about coins, not as a statement about how far the family had fallen, just as a man in his 80s trying to recover something that had been taken from him, using the legal systems of a state, where his father's name once carried the kind of weight that bent those same legal systems to criminal purposes. The irony would not have been lost on anyone who knew the history. The coins were stolen. The filing was routine. The name Patriarca appeared in court documents about property theft, and that was the last we heard. In 2024, law enforcement intelligence indicated that a partnership had formed between what remained of the Patriarca family and the Gambino crime family from New York. The partnership was apparently focused on the Connecticut faction, historically the most unstable part of the Patriarca operation, geographically distant from both Providence and Boston, difficult to control from either base. What this partnership revealed was important. Raymond Patriarca Sr. had maintained his relationships with the New York families as equals. He had territorial deals, the Connecticut River as a dividing line with the Genovese, a formal arrangement with the Commission. He was a peer. The Gambino arrangement in 2024 was not that. A family of approximately 30 made members, unable to sustain operations in its own territory without outside support, entering into a partnership with a much larger and more powerful New York organization, not as equals, as something closer to a client. The family that had once been powerful enough to sit at the table of the National Commission was now dependent on outside alliances to survive. If you walked Atwell's Avenue tonight, you would find a neighborhood that has been transformed into something that guidebooks describe as one of Providence's most charming destinations. Restaurants line both sides of the street, wine bars, artisan bakeries. The smell of garlic and tomatoes still comes from the kitchen windows, though the kitchens now serve upscale Italian-American cuisine to suburban couples and college students and tourists. The building that housed the National Cigarette Service Company and Coinomatic Distributors is still on Atwell's Avenue, renovated, repurposed. The sign about vending machines is long gone. On the walls of some of the older establishments, there are photographs, black and white, men in suits from another era, the neighborhood in an earlier time. You can look at them and feel the distance between then and now. Some of the older residents, the ones who grew up when the name Patriarca meant something very specific, when tribute was paid on schedule and the office on Atwell's Avenue was the center of a criminal universe. Some of those people look at those photographs and remember former Rhode Island State Police Superintendent Colonel Brendan Doherty, who spent 24 years in the State Police Intelligence Unit focused on organized crime in the 1980s and 1990s, described what Federal Hill was like under Patriarca with a clarity that only someone who was there can provide. Back then in the 60s and 70s, there was, shall we say, an arrangement between the police and organized crime. Doherty said, the Mafia was expected to keep the lid on it. The violence, keep it out of public places. Restaurant on Federal Hill paid tribute to Patriarca for protection. The protection was real, not from other criminals, but from the chaos that comes when there is no authority, when there is a recognized power that everyone understands and respects and fears. A kind of dark order exists. The streets are, in their way, safe, not because the law works, but because the boss's law works. When the boss is gone, when the organization fractures and the power disperses and the code breaks down, something is lost. Even if what was lost was itself terrible, its absence produces a different kind of problem. This is the complicated truth that Federal Hill's residents sometimes articulate about the Patriarca era, and that scholars of organized crime have documented in many cities. The mob's iron discipline, however brutal and however criminal, produced a kind of order. Its absence did not produce justice. It produced chaos, different kinds of violence, different kinds of fear. The people who lived under the Patriarca family's dominion were not free. They paid tribute. They kept their mouths shut. They lived under the shadow of an organization that could, at any moment, decide that their interests conflicted with its own. But the streets were, in their particular way, organized. That organization is gone. The FBI did not replace it with justice. It replaced it with absence. Come back with me one more time. Come back to Atwell's Avenue in Providence, Rhode Island. It's a morning in the early 1960s. The city is waking up. The bakeries have been open since 4 in the morning. The smell of bread has been on the air for hours already. The street vendors are setting up. Old men in suspenders are opening the shutters on their shops. Children are running to school. The neighborhood is making the sounds it makes every morning. The specific sounds of Federal Hill, the city's Italian quarter, the smells and rhythms that haven't changed in decades. And at a 2-story building on Atwell's Avenue, a man in a well-pressed suit is standing on the sidewalk. He has a cigar. He is not smoking it urgently. He holds it the way a man holds something when he is thinking about something else. He is watching the street, watching who comes, watching who goes, looking for faces that don't belong. He is not large. He does not project menace through any obvious physical quality. He looks, to anyone who doesn't know him, like a successful small businessman taking a moment outside his shop on a clear morning. But the man who runs a fruit stand across the street knows him, and the man who delivers the newspapers knows him, and the police officer in the cruiser who just turned the corner knows him, and not one of them will look him in the eye without calculating in the back of their mind what it means to be on his good side, what it would mean to be on the other one. His name is Raymond Patriarca, and everything, all of it, every dollar and every vote and every promise and every threat and every murder and every deal made in every back room in every city in New England. All of it flows to the man standing on the sidewalk with a cigar. This is the image that contains the whole story. From that sidewalk, Patriarca built something that would last for 30 years at full strength and another 40 years in decline. He built it through intelligence and ruthlessness and absolute certainty. He built it by understanding better than anyone around him what power actually was. Not the performance of power, not the symbols of power, but the real thing, the ability to make things happen, to prevent things from happening, to shape the world according to your will. He built it by being willing to do what others would not do, by being willing to order things that others could not order, by being willing to enforce a code that most people could barely comprehend existed. And when he died, when the heart that had driven him for 76 years finally gave out in a house in North Providence on a July morning, the thing he built began to come apart. Not all at once, not dramatically, slowly. His son was not him. His son was a decent man. The federal judge said so explicitly. A man with no penchant for violence. A man who told new initiates that membership was not a ticket to abuse people. These are not disqualifying qualities in a human being. They are disqualifying qualities in a mafia boss. The structure Patriarca had built required a specific kind of authority at its center. Without that authority, the centrifugal forces that had always existed in any large criminal organization, the factional interests, the personal ambitions, the temptations of betrayal, had nothing strong enough to hold them in place. The FBI had always been there. The wiretaps and informants and RICO prosecutions had always been external pressure. What changed was the internal strength. And then the things that could not have been predicted happened. The FBI's own corruption, the Conley relationship, the protection of Fleming and Bulger, the framing of innocent men in the Deegan case, produced scandals that consumed enormous institutional energy and moral authority. The revelation that the Bureau had been protecting criminals more dangerous than the ones it was pursuing produced a crisis of legitimacy that the Boston field office spent years recovering from. Salem flipped. The boss of the Patriarca family became a government witness. The code that had been the organization's skeleton, the thing that held everything together when everything else was under pressure, was broken by the man who was supposed to be its living embodiment. The family never recovered. 30 made members, a disbanded FBI squad, a Gambino partnership to hold together a Connecticut faction too weak to stand on its own, a boss who died at 68 of natural causes, the son of the original boss filing a civil lawsuit about coins, from the National Commission to civil court about coins, from the Dunes Hotel in Las Vegas to a marijuana grow operation called Organic Bees, from a man who walked the streets of Providence without a bodyguard because no one would dare touch him, to a man who needed a federal judge's mercy not to die in prison. This is a full arc. There's one last thing to say. In all the years of recorded conversations, the bugs in the office, the bugs in the Prince Street doghouse, the recordings at 34, Guild Street in Medford, there is something that stands out. Not what was said, what wasn't said. Raymond Patriarca was recorded hundreds of times over those 3 years the FBI maintained their surveillance. He talked about everything. About money, about murders, about political payoffs, about Christmas gifts of stolen watch bands, about slugs for vending machines, about the texture of daily criminal life in all its mundane detail. But he never, not in any of the recordings, not in anything any informant ever testified to, expressed out regret, second thoughts. He said on one of those recordings, "In this thing of ours, your love for your mother and father is one thing. Your love for the family is a different kind of love." He believed that. He built his whole life around it. He built an empire around it. He enforced it with murder and exile and terror. And it worked. For 30 years, it worked. The silence he created in Federal Hill, in the North End, in every community his organization touched, was real. It was a kind of silence that made men confess things they'd never tell their priest. Not confess to Patriarca. Confess the things he wanted confessed. Reveal the things he needed revealed. Say the names he needed said. And then, eventually that silence broke. One man at a time. One betrayal at a time. until the organization that had been held together by the absolute fear of absolute consequences was held together by nothing at all. The Patriarca family never went out in one final blaze. They faded slowly, like the last ember of fire that once burned so hot you could feel the heat all the way from Providence to Las Vegas. Raymond Patriarca built something that took the FBI 30 years to crack. And even then, it didn't fall all at once. It just got quieter and quieter and quieter until one day, the office on Federal Hill was just a storefront. The silence was just a silence. And the streets of New England had no one left to fear. Rest now. You made it to the end. Drop a hat in the comments. I want to know who's still awake. The next story is already being researched. Another family, another city, another 100 years. If this journey was worth your time, subscribe, like, and share it with one person who would have stayed up all night for this. And if you fell asleep somewhere in the middle, that's the whole point. Sweet dreams.